Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We're going to get started in about 2 minutes. Hello. Thank you for joining us for the 23rd Annual Virtual Elder Abuse Conference, Serving Older Adults During Times of Isolation. This conference is presented by the Syracuse Area Domestic and Sexual Violence Coalition's Elder Justice Committee. My name is Lori DiCaprio Lee, and I am the ID Theft and Outreach Coordinator at Vera House. Before we begin today's presentation, I'd like to acknowledge some recent events. The COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted issues of inequality. Older adults, those who live in poverty, and members of Black and Brown communities have been more severely impacted. The Elder Justice Committee values all older adults and stands in solidarity with the Black community. We pledge to uplift the voices of Black people in our community and strive to fight the injustices that have led us to this moment. Thank you. So moving on to other announcements. All webinars offered during this conference are free, thanks to the generous support of our sponsors. And I want to particularly recognize our platinum sponsors, Loretto and Onondaga County Department of Adult and Long-Term Care Services. Our gold sponsors, Syracuse Jewish Family Service and Wegmans, and our silver sponsors, Alzheimer's Association of CNY, At Home Independent Living, Community Bank, Countryside Federal Credit Union, Crouse Health, Fulton Savings Bank, Syracuse University School of Social Work, and Touching Hearts at Home. More information about all of our sponsors can be found on Vera House's website. The support of these sponsors not only funds this webinar series, but also extends beyond the conference to continue elder abuse education and prevention outreach after the event. One last announcement before we begin the webinar. The chat feature is disabled. However, you can ask questions using the Q&A, which we will be saving to the end. So today's webinar is Elder Abuse 101, a social justice issue, and the COVID-19 impact. And our presenter is Jenny Ackley, the director of the Abuse in Later Life program at Vera House. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jenny and start sharing her screen.
Thank you, Lori. So that everyone can focus on the interpreter, I am going to stop my video share as well. So thank you all for joining us today. Today my goal is to provide an overview of elder abuse, but I want to spend time addressing it from a social justice perspective. As Lori mentioned, at Vera House, we recognize that the current civil unrest is a reflection of racial disparities that have existed for centuries. COVID-19 has exposed not only these disparities, but also ageism and the serious issue of social isolation that is impacting older people in our community. And this month is also LGBTQ Awareness Month, which recognizes another group who experiences higher rates of abuse. All of these topics are critical, I will attempt to share the importance of looking at all of these intersecting oppressions, and as a result, hope to enhance your understanding of the issue of elder abuse and the importance of all of us providing culturally competent services. Because this is a new presentation, I will take questions at the end, but please feel free to type in your questions as we go along, because I know if you're like me, it's helpful to get your thoughts down when you're thinking of them. Lori, next slide. So back about 2 years ago, the Elder Justice Committee, which is our local coalition, which is a subcommittee of the Syracuse Area Domestic and Sexual Violence Coalition, spent some time re-looking at our vision statement and our mission statement. And what you see on the screen right now is what we came up with as part of that work. And as you see noted in red, I really wanted to highlight the fact that we spent a lot of time really thinking about the fact that we wanted to look at justice. We wanted our vision to be a just society that treats elders with respect. And our mission statement was to prevent elder abuse and promote elder justice through collaboration, advocacy, education, and intervention. And we're doing that in a lot of ways with several subcommittees. So if any of you at some point who are attending this webinar are interested in some of the work that our Elder Justice Committee does, please feel free to send an email or respond in the questions that you'd like more information. You can also find that information on the Vera House website. There's an elder abuse tab at www.verahouse.org. Next slide, please. So when I talk about social justice is for all, no matter your age, race, or gender. To prepare for this presentation, I did look up a definition, which I'll read now. And it states, social justice is an ideal condition in which all members of society have the same basic rights, protection, opportunity, obligations, and social benefits. That's a lofty goal, and I think it's one we need to continue to look at, not only from the frame of elder abuse, but across our entire community. Next slide, please. So what does this mean for older adults today? First, I want to start with elder abuse in general. When we think about elder abuse and social justice, we believe that older adults deserve the right to live with dignity and respect, free of elder abuse, neglect, and exploitation. And then COVID happens, and we need to layer in issues that happened as a result of COVID, which highlighted issues of ageism and race. I'll discuss that a little more in a bit. Then we layer on the impact of the murder of George Floyd and the increased awareness brought about through the Black Lives Matter movement regarding the disparities in our justice system for Black and Brown communities and how that might also affect the older adults we serve. And June is LGBTQ Awareness Month, and we need to be aware of the barriers older adults face who identify as LGBTQ. In the fields of domestic and sexual violence, we long ago recognized that sexism was a major contributing factor. We now recognize how other forms of oppression, including racism, homophobia, transphobia, and ageism, also intersect with that victimization. Next slide, please. Ashton Applewhite is an advocate who speaks out against ageism. For some of you who attend our conferences on an annual basis, you'll remember she came to our conference a couple years ago. She has a website entitled thischairrocks.com. And there's actually a place on that website called Yo, is this ageist? And you can share information you might be seeing in the media, and she'll respond to it. She recently posted a blog about COVID and its impact on ageism. In her comments, she mentioned that there were headlines like, ageism on the rise, or pandemic making ageism worse. Two examples she shared were Jeremy Warner, a Telegraph journalist from the UK, who stated, not to put too fine a point on it, from an entirely disinterested economic perspective, the COVID-19 might even prove mildly beneficial in the long term by disproportionately culling elderly dependents. That was a terrible word. Anyway, and then in another, she also mentions Texas Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick, who proposed that perhaps grandparents would be willing to sacrifice themselves for the good of the economy to help their children and grandchildren. Of course, these are just a couple of sound bites, but certainly they indicate a lack of support for older adults. Of course, this is not unusual. Before COVID-19, I have often heard of the silver tsunami, again, turning an aging society into a crisis. But this is not new. According to Ashton, the pandemic isn't generating more prejudice, it's glaringly exposing the ageism and ableism that have been all around us all along. Because ageism is so unexamined, the pandemic is bringing it to many people's attention for the very first time. It's not ageist and ableist attitudes and behaviors that are on the rise, it's the public's awareness and outrage about these types of stigma and discrimination. Next slide. Moving on to racism and how this has also become more apparent through the COVID crisis. We have often heard that individuals with underlying health conditions were more at risk. In fact, although 13% of the US population is Black, 24% of the deaths happen to Black individuals. Why? Well, as our nation dug deeper into that issue, these health conditions were really a result of racism that has, I'm sorry for the siren, I'll let that go by. Well, as our nation dug deeper into that issue, these health conditions were really a result of racism that has created inequality in access to healthcare, housing, education, and employment. And all of these things impact health. Incrementally, a higher percentage of essential workers were Black and brown, and many lived in densely populated homes or apartment buildings, again, increasing the risk for infection. Immigrants and refugees are also at a higher risk due to these issues. Next slide, please. And then there was May 25th. On that date, a man named George Floyd was killed at the hands of a police officer. Protests continue today over that event. And yet, this was yet another incident that highlighted the ongoing systemic racism in our country. How does this impact older adults who face issues of abuse, neglect, and exploitation? Well, most of our response to cases of elder abuse have come through the justice system in the past, perpetrators being arrested for their abuse. And yet, for many of you in the field of elder abuse, you recognize that most abuse happens by whom? At the hands of family members. And what we know is most older adults we work with really do not want their family members arrested. And even if the older victim wishes to prosecute, it can be very difficult to prove that when the family is involved. So how does this impact older adults in these communities? Our services will not work for them. We need to be creative and we need to come up with new ideas. Next slide. And in honor of LGBTQ Awareness Month, we also need to understand the incremental barriers. Victimization rates are substantially higher for older LGBTQ adults. If you look at this slide, 65% report some kind of victimization due to their sexual orientation. 29% experience physical abuse. And again, they have many other barriers to obtaining service. I'm now going to have Lori share a video highlighting just some of these issues. Lori, can you share the video now?
When we first started doing this work, the whole area of late life domestic violence was foreign. You know, society as a whole does not want to hear that grandpa batters grandma. They just don't want to go there. And so trying to penetrate anywhere in our society was very, very difficult at first.
If a woman is 62, she can apply for Social Security. By the time she's 65, she can get health insurance. She has Medicare. The problem for the victim between 50 and 62 and 65 is they have no medical care. They don't have Social Security. They don't have any kind of retirement. And so there are more of those challenges for that sort of notch group between 50 and 62.
By looking at the clients we were serving, we found that many of them were returning to their abusers due to a lack of options. So we went back to the drawing board again and found, once again, that traditional transitional housing programs for victims of domestic violence are earmarked for women with children under the age of 18. Or if you were a single woman, you had to have a job or be in some kind of training program. Well, you know, for many of our women that we were working with, at 67 years old, she wasn't ready to go to work. She wasn't going to go to school or, you know, enroll in a training program. So she had no options, which is, again, we found time and time again. If we also look at the way the media portrays a victim of domestic violence, you know, what does she look like? She's often a younger woman with a black eye and a child tugging at her skirt, right? She's sitting there and she can't relate to that. She doesn't identify herself as that. And then there's the shame and the guilt. Tremendous, tremendous shame and guilt. It is not uncommon for an older woman to come to a group perhaps one time, maybe twice, and not come back again.
Well, I work with all cultures, and they're all somewhat different. The African American, it's comes from slavery, the silent thing. It was an unwritten law that what goes on here stays here.
The advice that I will give is to be patient and don't get discouraged by the first failure, because working with refugees, it's a long process and it involves a lot of challenges. There are a lot of situations that refugees are in that are, you know, really, really important for them to take care of, which will be their basic needs. And then be careful not to introduce our domestic violence subject just suddenly. Take your time, and it's a process that goes step by step.
What we have experienced with women over 50 is that the services are limited, especially when you're thinking about immigrant women that are new in the country who have less access, I will say, that, you know, the other community or the rest of the women, Latina women. We have to be very open and in listening to what they say about their own situations, because, you know, the limitations are very, it's a lot of limitations. It's a lot of barriers. Many women are monolingual. They may not speak English. The resources are very limited because most of the women we work with are undocumented. So the resources for women over 50 are limited in general. So just think about for Latinas who are new to the country, who may not have a legal status in the country, who may not know the system and do not know how to navigate the system. So we are very clear that we take each case as, different. We definitely listen to what they wanted to do, and they may be very different than the rest of the women, just based on her own reality.
And then I think you need also to know your history. realizing that the LGBTQ community is not one monolithic community. It's a whole constellation of communities within communities, and some people hold place in more than one of those communities. You know, I may be a lesbian of color, and I may be a lesbian and of color, and you know, whatever. And if I have a partner who is abusive and I am getting old, and a lot of my friends have died or moved or that sort of thing, my community may be very small, and I may not have another place to go. And to go to a nursing home where I'm going to face, you know, censure, or particularly if I was trans, and in that situation, to go to a nursing home is, there's, you know, I'm not sure that I wouldn't rather be homeless, and that's kind of a death sentence for an old person, you know?
So I appreciate that video because it really shows the intersectionality of the issues of elder abuse. Older adults are not one generalized community. There are subsets and things that we need to be aware of from a lot of different angles in order to provide really culturally responsive services. I'm going to move on now a little bit to a specific framework that was created by Frameworks Institute. Back in 2016, I show the link there, they came up with a study and a toolkit that could be utilized to discuss how to talk about elder abuse. They've also done work in general, if you're interested in how to address the issue of ageism in general. But today I'm going to focus in on the social justice perspective, and I'm going to share a couple pieces of the items in their toolkit. Can you advance to the next slide, please? One of the tools is called Mapping the Gaps, and it compares how experts might respond to issues versus how the public might see them. And I'm going to discuss a few of them with you right now. The first is, how salient is the issue of elder abuse? With experts, they might cite the prevalence that it occurs to 14% of older adults, and that percentage goes up to 50% in cases of dementia. They might address how underreported it is. In our community, based on Central New York statistics, 1 in 35 cases are reported. Experts also understand there's 5 types: physical, emotional, neglect, financial exploitation, sexual abuse. While the public, they usually think of physical abuse, they might think of emotional, and infrequently neglect, and they think it's rare. They often don't think about financial exploitation as a kind of abuse, and sexual abuse hardly ever comes up. When we start moving on to the next question, why do we think elder abuse happens? If you talk to experts, they key in on social structures that put people in the position to commit abuse, and that leaves others susceptible to experiencing it. It's a public policy issue, and they're falling short. There's not sufficient resources. There's issues of isolation, ageism. With public, you tend to look at individual deficits. Who is the person who commits it? Are they selfish? It's a greedy child. They're sick. It's payback. And very often, they don't have a whole lot of respect for older adults. That's part of the ageism in our society. The next, how should older adults be engaged when this is happening? If you talk to an expert, we really talk about the issues of empowerment. And we respect that the aging process is one of gaining wisdom and freedom and fulfillment. However, when you think about the public, if you start talking about older adults and how they should be engaged, very often They're seen as objects of care, vulnerable and helpless. How do we balance those couple of things? We need to be focusing on those. Who's responsible for fixing it? Experts will say society. It's our social institutions and supports. In the public, they tend to look at an individual at a time. That person needs help and somebody needs to fix it. They don't tend to see it as a societal issue. Can anything be done? Experts believe in funding APS and strengthening community supports, funding research. Within Onondaga County, we have a multidisciplinary team, and that's a big focus of work right now. Within the public, they're often unsure. And sadly, sometimes they feel it's inevitable that deterioration happens and elder abuse happens because of that. So what should we do? Experts believe there's systemic solutions, that we've got to fix the system. We've got to reduce isolation. We need to look at prevention of the issue. On the public, they really see things as needing more surveillance. You've got to report the cases. You've got to screen caregivers, and that education and PR campaigns need to be out there to change behavior. So you can see in all of those, there's very different perceptions, and we really need to start focusing in on changing the perceptions of the public to expand their knowledge into some of the issues that I discussed from the experts. Next slide. You can actually advance to the next one. So how should we talk about elder abuse? This is another one of the items in their toolkit. I know it's kind of hard to read, and I apologize for that, but it is accessible on their website, and I'll cover a few of the items here. First, instead of appealing to sympathy, it's important to appeal to justice and fair treatment. Instead of talking about older adults as vulnerable, frail, or dependent, talk about the importance of social connection. Instead of focusing only on individual perpetrators and victims, understand that there are social conditions that increase these risk factors, just as we were speaking about before. And instead of using criminal justice language like perpetrators and victims, use people who commit abuse and survivors. The framing of the issue is really critical. Next slide. So now I'm going to move on to some general facts about elder abuse. First, very often when I do this presentation out in the field and I ask participants, where do most older adults reside? They don't come up with 95% of older adults living at home or with family. And most often they think most abuse is happening in nursing homes. That is just not the case. We do know it does happen in institutions, but it also happens much more often in the home at the hands of family members. Next slide, please. And who is the typical survivor of this? Well, often it's women, but that doesn't mean that it is not men or other genders. Usually the person is over 75. And once a person turns 80, they're abused at 3 times more often than the rest of the population. Why is it tends to be people over 75? Well, as you age, you do become more vulnerable to some of those issues. Your health may deteriorate and more supports need to be put in place. So those chronic health conditions, and especially dementia, can create some of those issues. Very often, the survivor lives with the person who is abusing them. Social isolation is one of the biggest risk factors, as is depression. So when you look at this profile, it makes you wonder, so why are these issues there? If we are thinking about this from a social justice perspective, what should we do to stop this from happening? How do we eliminate social isolation? How do we build caregiver supports so that the person who abuses them does not do so, and that if there is something happening, that it is caught? How do we support people who have dementia? Can we have assisted decision-making available in those cases? Are there ways to support that individual? Next slide, please. And the typical profile of those who abuse, for those of you in the field, this is no surprise. The children, 47% of the time. Spouses and partners, another 19% of the time. Grandchildren, 9%. Sisters, brothers, other relatives, 9%, and siblings, 6%. If you add all of those up, you realize that 90% of abuse happens at the hands of family members. And to make it a little bit worse, your friends and neighbors are in there at 6% as well. Many people perceive that abuse happens at the hands of strangers. And as you look at this slide, only 3% of in-home providers and 1% of abuse happens at the hands of out-of-home providers. So only 4% of overall abuse happens at the hands of strangers. Why do people perceive that there's a lot more danger out there than the issue of family abuse? I think it's because of what's portrayed in the media. I think it's because it's not reported. Because very often, as I mentioned before, if a family member is abusing another family member, very often there's a lot of shame and people may not report that. Or when we talk about intersectionality, if the only option is to report this into the justice system, that may not be seen as a good option. Next slide, please. And for those who abuse, what tend to be some characteristics there? Well, there tends to be a need for money, whether or not that might be a drug or alcohol or gambling problem. If they may not have a job, so they might be dependent on the victim for financial support. Most older adults have access to whether it be Social Security or a pension, so they have monthly support coming in, so there might be a need for that support. There may be a history of domestic violence. It might be a caregiver who's ill-prepared and reluctant to provide that care, so neglect becomes problematic. They might be resistant to outside help. Very often, these individuals are over the age of 50. And as I mentioned before, they are most often a family member. Next slide, please. The types of abuse are as listed here: physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional, financial exploitation, and neglect. And most have a sense on what physical abuse might be. And yes, it can be those severe things, a hit, a punch. But when you think about older adults, physical abuse can be a shove. Does that create fear? Sure it does. So that is a form of physical abuse. It may not be something that's prosecutable, but it certainly is physical abuse. Sexual abuse, yes, it does happen to older adults. We have gone to the hospital and been with individuals who have been raped. But again, similar to sexual abuse or similar to physical abuse, sexual abuse can also look somewhat different. What about a person providing care and bathing an individual, but making terrible, nasty comments about that person's body? That's sexual abuse. It might look different than a rape, but it is sexual abuse. Emotional abuse can be those criticisms, those negative comments. You're worthless because you need all this support. Financial exploitation can be almost anything you can believe. It can be small withdrawals coming from an ATM, and it might start there. Or somebody picking up a few groceries while they're out picking up groceries for their loved one. And then it gets easy and the exploitation increases. It can be executing a power of attorney and misusing that. It can be scams. It can be identity theft. It can be taking credit cards out in a person's name. It really can be a real broad amount of things. And then there's neglect. And neglect is tricky. Self-neglect does happen to older adults, but very often there are individuals who are charged with caring for an older adult. Sometimes they're trying their best, but they need supports. That's called passive neglect. Other times, the neglect is purposeful. That's active neglect, not feeding, not bathing, not medicating. So there's different kinds. And what we know is in all of these cases, They very often intersect with each other. If you as a service provider identify emotional abuse, I'd say dig a little deeper. You're likely going to find something else. If you work for a financial institution and you see financial exploitation, dig a little deeper. There might be neglect going on. There might be emotional abuse going on. It's important to understand that all of these work together. Next slide, please. And indicators of abuse, there's a wide variety of indicators. So I have a few of them listed here. Certainly if there's injuries, bruising, cuts, and burns, but again, we need to be careful. Not every bruise on an older adult is indicative of abuse. Very often, older adults might bruise. So what is the location of those bruises? There's studies that evaluate that. If they're on the sides of the body or on somebody's back, they're more likely to be a result of abuse. But also, how are they explained? Does the caregiver say one thing and the patient says something else? Are they happening frequently? Try to get some information behind that. Doctor hopping. If an older adult is suddenly seeing lots of different doctors, it's perhaps because they don't want the doctor to understand that this is happening, perhaps at the hands of a family member. How do they behave in front of the caregiver? Does the caregiver jump in and start speaking for the patient? What is their behavior in general? Are they more anxious now than they used to be? Do they seem to be depressed? What's happening? Is it different than it was before? And then this sense of hopelessness or resignation and acceptance. Next slide, please. For sexual abuse, if you're not in the medical field, you might not have access to really see injuries that are related to sexual abuse. However, if all of a sudden an individual has difficulty walking or standing, needing a walker, it is possible that some sexual assault may have happened. Dive into that. Oh, what happened? Pressure sores. Pressure sores can happen even with good care. But if pressure sores are severe, you need to dive in. Is that a reflection of neglect? Is there a change in hygiene? Are they over or under medicated? Do they not have medication that was prescribed? Is the medication gone? Diving into financial abuse, are there missing funds? Are they all of a sudden bouncing checks or not able to pay bills? Are there new credit accounts? Have wills been changed or healthcare proxies or powers of attorney been changed? Or is the caregiver very, very overly concerned about their finances? Next slide, please. What we need to understand about the issue of elder abuse is there are tremendous emotional barriers to reporting. When I bring this up to different groups, and specifically older adults, and I say, so why do you think this isn't reported? Usually the first thing they talk about is embarrassment, guilt, and shame. They would not want anyone to know that a family member or a friend was doing this to them. They're overwhelmed. They may be fearful. Fearful of what? Well, if they're reliant on that person for their care, they might be fearful that they won't be able to get that care. What else might they be afraid of? They might be afraid of the abuse getting worse. They might be in denial. It's not so bad. Grief is on here, and I think it's an important one because it's a time when many older adults are very vulnerable. If a loved one has passed away and an older adult is grieving, we know that it is harder for that individual to process. They may be slower in response. They may be more confused. That is part of the normal grieving process. Sadly, we also know that very often obituaries are put in the paper. And guess what? People then know that that person has lost a loved one, and sadly, they may be exploited for that reason. They might have loyalty to the family member. They might be lonely, and this person might be the only connection they have. So there are so many barriers to reporting. Next page, please. So what are the primary victim services? Well, within Onondaga County, for those of you who are in Onondaga County, there are a wide variety of services in our community. I'm only going to highlight a few of them. Onondaga County Adult and Long-Term Care Services houses both adult protective services and the Office for Aging, among other services that they also provide. They are a great resource for information and referrals. I'll talk a little bit about each of them in a moment, but let me go on. Vera House has a 24-hour crisis and support line. I highly recommend that number if you're even having general questions. You do not need to be in crisis, but if you're just looking for resources in the community and don't quite know where to turn, Vera House is a resource for you. Again, the justice system can be important. If you are in an emergency right now, 911 is the place to call. Adult Protective Services is not a 24/7 agency, cannot provide emergency services. Same with Office for Aging. 911 would be if you were in an emergency situation. And I also list the Onondaga County District Attorney's Office if you believe you are a victim of crime and want to have some support in that way. There again are very, very many other services available in our community, but if you start with any of these services, I think you can find many others. Next slide, please. For adult protective services, there are requirements to be eligible for adult protective services. Very often, older adults have never heard of this, community members have never heard about adult protective. They might have heard of child protective, and when they hear adult protective, they think it's the same. But adult protective does not in any way have the same rights and responsibilities as child protective services. There are these 3 specific criteria required to be eligible for those services. First, there has to be a physical or a mental impairment. Second, the individual has to be at risk of harm, so they are unable to manage their own resources or carry out their activities of daily living, and they're unable to protect themselves because of that. And the third, which is really critically responsible, or is critically important, is that they have no one available who is willing and able to provide assistance in a responsible way. If you are making a referral to adult protective, I think that's one of the most important things. They might have a family member who is more than willing to provide assistance, but they are not doing it in a responsible way. So if you do make a referral to adult protective services, it would be important for you to state why that service is not being provided in a responsible fashion. Next slide, please. New York State today is the only state that does not have mandatory reporting for elder abuse in the community. There are some mandates for elder abuse happening in facilities, but there is no mandatory reporting for elder abuse in the community. But anyone can voluntarily report. There are certain laws that do provide immunity if you are reporting in good faith. So under New York State Social Services law, that provides some immunity. Financial institutions have been encouraged to report both by agencies within New York State and the federal government. I've seen guidance from credit unions and the Banking Association. So certainly there is encouragement there. And then many medical providers may hesitate to report because they're concerned about HIPAA privacy rules, but Adult Protective Services is covered under HIPAA privacy laws. There is permission to report. Next slide, please. The Office for Aging is another one of those important resources. Again, they can provide information and referral information. They have many caregiver resources available. They might link you to community services, which are all around our community. They have senior nutrition, both through nutrition sites and Meals on Wheels, which in the time of COVID, the Meals on Wheels has become very critical. And there has been a lot of work done in the Office for Aging to ensure older adults at home are getting the food and products that they need. And finally, they have case management through neighborhood advisor programs and ISIF case managers. Next slide, please. And what about Vera House? What can we be providing? And this would be the same, but let me even just stop for a second and say, if you're tuning in from other counties, please know that Office for Aging and Adult Protective Services are available in every county of the United States. Additionally, most counties, all counties have some form of domestic violence agency or sexual assault agency, and they may also be able to provide those services. Within Onondaga County, Vera House provides both domestic and sexual violence services. And incrementally, we have some specialized services for older adults. Our 24-hour crisis and support line supports all language. We have access to a language line, so that's available. We have a shelter, and within that shelter, we do have accessible rooms for older adults. We cannot provide medical care in our shelter, but we can provide safe shelter for older adults. We have support groups, both domestic violence education, and we actually have a special support group for older adults. We have an elder advocate who works one-on-one with adults over the age of 50. What we found is there are very different needs and supports that are often available for older victims of abuse. So having that specialized advocate really is helpful. The elder advocate works very closely with other community-based organizations, including the justice system, as well as adult protective. So if you have a case and you'd like to work with somebody, we will manage and go on some joint visits if that's something that's helpful, to make sure that you can start building trust. But one thing that's important to state about Vera House is our services are voluntary. We will work with an older adult and we will provide the services that they choose, but we will not choose what services are important to them. Another thing I think that's important to state about Vera House services, and it ties in with the earlier conversation, we are not mandated to report crimes to the criminal justice system. The only time that we might need to make a report is in cases of child abuse or in case of risk of harm to self or others. But in most cases, our services are completely confidential. So we will work with an individual to assist them in whatever direction they wish to choose to go in. Do they want to continue to find a safe way to work with the individual who is abusing them? If they do want to move and utilize the criminal justice system, we can help them with that. We can help get them an order of protection. We can do that virtually today. We have an ability to do that today with COVID. So that's an option. Or we can accompany them to court. Now again, a little different today in the time of COVID, but that is also an option. Our counseling is available also for victims of sexual assault. And that can be anything from a current sexual assault to something that happened years and years ago. And we often find sometimes if a sexual assault is in the news, that might become a trigger for somebody where that might have happened to them in the past. Yes, our services are available for them as well. And all of these services that I'm talking about are free of charge. Finally, we have an enhanced multidisciplinary team. What is that? That is an intensive case management group where we look at individual cases of abuse, neglect, and exploitation. We have standard people on our team from the criminal justice system, from Office for Aging, District Attorney's Office, law enforcement, Adult Protective Service, Office for Aging. We have a nurse, we have a civil attorney, our elder advocate, and anyone else who might be involved in that specific case. So if you have a case that you're working with an older adult and you don't know where to go, this is a possible avenue for you to go. And if you do have one of those cases, I would encourage you to reach out and contact Vera House to see whether or not it might qualify for a team approach on that. Next slide, please. On the Vera House website, again, www.verahouse.org, you can see the website at the bottom of this slide. There are many, many resources. And if you click on the Elder Abuse tab, there are many resources there, including information about the EMDT I just mentioned. You'll also see a link to resources. One of those resources is what you see here. It's a decision tree. The decision trees were created by the Elder Justice Committee and are great tools to help providers navigate the systems that are in place. There's a screening tool on one side. You see that on the right-hand side of this page. The criteria for adult protective services are noted. I mentioned earlier about privacy laws. There are links to information there. And then the flow chart really kind of helps you navigate the system. In the green box are resources available in our community. So we have decision trees that are generic for professional services, but we also have decision trees for the medical community who might, as I mentioned, have questions about HIPAA. We have them for the financial community who might be talking about things like SARS, which would be a suspicious activity report. They have different rules. And we also have one for the justice system and for older adults themselves. These are available online and can also be ordered if you want to have laminated copies. Next slide, too. We also have a variety of other outreach resources. On this slide, I'm showing two of the posters that we have. We have them in English and we have them in Spanish. We also have brochures and wallet cards available both in English and in Spanish. Additionally, on that website, we have access to information about identity theft and scams and resources related to that. We have some general information about elder abuse and a link to our enhanced multidisciplinary team and information about that. Next slide, please. So with that, I'd like to close with a quote from Frameworks Institute, which I mentioned before. Creating a just society includes treating older people as equal members and making sure we are all connected to our communities as we age so that we can prevent and address elder abuse. I hope this presentation has inspired you to do just that. Look around. What are the policies and protocols that we need to be putting in place today to help older adults live with dignity and respect? And let's continue to work towards that. With that, Lori, I'll turn it over for questions.
Okay, so just a general comment. We did have a few people asking if they could get a copy of the PowerPoint, and they certainly can email me or Jenny, and we are more than happy to share that. So
Might I also say that we hope to put that on our website when all of the conferences, all the conference presentations are done. We hope to have a web page where you'll have access to the PowerPoints and actually we're hoping we'll be able to rebroadcast them.
Okay. And one other general comment. Jenny did talk about some of the adult and long-term care services, as well as adult protective services. We do have an upcoming webinar where representatives from those two agencies will be talking about not only what their agency services are in general, but how those services have been affected by the current pandemic. So if you're interested in that, please go to our website and sign up for that. And let's look at the questions. We had two questions, Jenny. I'm going to read them to you. The first one is this information about elder abuse taught to doctors?
Okay, so I will say what we have found is there is some general information that is typically provided to medical students and nurses. We have also tried as part of our outreach work to make some presentations to the medical communities. We've done some grand rounds. I know actually Lori has made presentations actually to doctors' offices. I made presentations at a geriatric nurses conference last year. So it is one of our priority areas to make presentations. And if you are aware of a location where presentations would be appropriate, please contact us. That is something that we do regularly. Again, in this field of COVID, we're trying to figure out how we might be able to even do or have access to online presentations. So, but yes, in the past, we have done face-to-face presentations. So if there's someone you want us to connect us to, we can even do things like this. So we can still do outreach presentations through Zoom.
Okay, and our other question, I'm going to read it to you. As an independent home care provider, I have seen a marked decline in the physical and psychosocial health and well-being of my patient in the several months he has been in lockdown at a local rehab. What can we do to put pressure on New York State to open up visitation to our patients in these circumstances in a controlled, safe way?
Boy, that's a great question and probably above my pay grade. But I'd say in general, we all need to be advocates for older adults. Now, we want to do things in a safe way. So how do we balance safety of older adults who we know are more susceptible to COVID with the need to reduce social isolation? Because we do understand that social isolation is such a health risk in and of itself. I don't have an easy answer, but my thought is if you have a specific idea or a specific request, I think those are the types of things that are being addressed on a one-to-one basis, depending on what the type of service is. So I would say that's where an advocate comes into play. And I think it's on all of us to advocate for the services that older adults in our community need. You're muted.
Sorry about that. So last check, that was the last question. So unless there's anything else, I want to say a huge thank you to our speaker, Jenny Ackley, and to our interpreter, Brianna, doing an amazing job for us. And if there's nothing else, I will thank all of you for participating, and I will end this webinar. All right, goodbye. Have a great day, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.